If you catch me at the border, I got visas in my name. If you come around here, I'll make them all day. I get one down in a second if you wait. I fly like paper, get high like planes. If you catch me at the border, I got visas in my name. If you come around here, I'll make them all day. I get one.
The song you're listening to is called Paper Planes by artist MIA. Now, I don't normally listen to this kind of music, but even I'm able to admit that this is an incredibly well-produced song. The song is definitely a surreal experience on your first time listening to it. The background music appears to be laid back, relaxed, even fun, but then the song includes lyrics like So, the song is intended to be a satire on how Americans view immigrants from third world countries, which was drawn by MIA's own personal experiences on her trouble getting a visa in the US. But I also find it interesting how MIA mixes a laid-back, relaxed style with satirical lyrics. It portrays this stereotype of immigrants, but not in the way that you'd expect. The stereotype figure presented is someone who is an illegal immigrant and criminal, but the style of the music tells us that they're so used to this lifestyle that it's normal, almost mundane for them. Again, this is supposed to be satirical of how Americans think immigrants from war-torn countries think, and I think MIA did pretty much the best job she could have on portraying that. But it's fitting then that Paper Planes is the first song you hear in the opening cutscene of the Ubisoft video game Far Cry 3, as the game attempts to have somewhat similar themes to the song.
I was 20 years old.
So Ubisoft as a game developer is interesting. Ubisoft aren't exactly known as auteurs in the gaming industry. Most of their games are fine. They hardly delve into anything deep or interesting, which is totally fine. Sure, most of their games aren't going to be in the Game of the Year conversation, but there's this huge divide in media-related communities between those who view it as art versus those who basically want nothing more than the summer blockbusters. While I love viewing things like video games through the lens of art, I also think that there's nothing wrong with creating something that's meant to just be enjoyed. Like, I'd hardly call Watch Dogs 2 a great game, but I have admittedly spent hours fooling around in the open world, which is what makes Far Cry a bit more interesting, as it seems to be the one Ubisoft franchise that at least wants to be taken more seriously as art. Far Cry 3 in particular seems to be interested in exploring these themes of analyzing the role of violence in video games. And I know that some people don't really like games that analyze violent video games and are all like, wait, am I the bad guy?
I'm the bad guy?
Yeah.
How'd that happen?
Now, I'll just say that these games aren't criticizing players or the industry for making and enjoying violent video games. Rather, they're just commenting on how strange it is that players enjoy performing unspeakable violent acts in video games, even in games with normal, non-violent side activities like GTA 5, yet still be a normal person in real life. No one is saying you're a bad person if you like violent video games, but there's nothing wrong with a bit of deconstruction either. So Far Cry 3 is interesting with these themes. The game follows a group of 20, 30-something friends who, while vacationing in Thailand, accidentally parachute onto a pirate-infested island. The protagonist, Jason, escapes the pirates and spends the rest of the game trying to take them down and save his friends. Breaking Bad fans might recognize Michael Mando as the game's central villain, Voss Montenegro. The game uses Voss and his relationship with Jason to deconstruct violence in video games, and throughout the game's narrative, it does an excellent job of that, and So Far Cry 3 for the first 2/3 has this guy, Voss, as the game's central villain, until about 2/3 of the way through the main narrative when Jason kills Voss. From this point forward, Voss is hardly even mentioned in the game, and the conflict shifts to taking down this drug lord or whatever. It feels as though we entered a completely new game. What's even stranger is that those themes of violence in video games is hardly applicable to the last third of the game. Now, if you're familiar with the production of Far Cry 3, this might make more sense. Despite being a central part of the game, you might be surprised to find out that Voss wasn't even supposed to be in the game in the first place. Apparently, Mando's audition was just so good that they decided to create the character just for him. And can I just say that this must have been one heck of an audition? Cause not only is Voss a huge villain in the game, but then the marketing of the game focused almost exclusively on his character, not only creating a whole live-action short film starring Mando himself, but Voss is even featured front and center on the game's box cover art. And the character wasn't even supposed to be in the game in the first place. If this isn't one of the best auditions of all time, I honestly don't know what is. So I can only speculate that what happens in the last third of the narrative is what was originally intended for most of the story, but the game never quite lives up to the first 2/3 with Voss as the antagonist. And Voss really is a great antagonist. I honestly think he's one of the best villains in literary history, not just video games, but fiction in general. Of course, part of that is just how menacing he is.
So they say to me, they say, boss, who the is it going to be? Them or me? Me or them?
But part of that is also his contribution to the game's themes. So Jason is an interesting choice for the protagonist of a first-person shooter. In the first mission of the game, Jason and his older brother Grant attempt to escape from the pirates when Grant is unexpectedly killed. Now, sure, this is somewhat expected since we're playing as Jason and not Grant, but from a gaming narrative perspective, this is interesting, since Grant was previously in the army. By comparison, Jason is a pacifist. He freaks out when he first kills someone, and even mentions how he never even fired a gun before.
I've never shot anyone before.
What do they say in America? There's a first time for everything.
By all means, it seems like Grant would be the most obvious choice for a first-person shooter protagonist. But he's killed immediately, making Jason, a pacifist who never fired a gun before, the protagonist of a first-person shooter. But the fact that Jason is such a fish out of water in this narrative is kind of the point. As the game continues, Jason becomes more and more accustomed to killing. This is first seen in this mission, where Jason has to use a flamethrower to destroy a field of drug crops. I mean, it's weed, isn't it? But look at the way it's presented.
Holy this is awesome!
I honestly don't think I really need to explain the subtext here. The music and performances pretty much speak for themselves. Jason is beginning to enjoy the carnage. And as the game's narrative continues, Jason continues to enjoy the violence he perpetrates. Which is where we get to Voss. So the idea of reflections is ever present throughout Far Cry 3. It's even used in the game's loading screens. Voss is supposed to be a reflection of Jason. Voss has been exposed to and has been used to the carnage for years now. This is who Jason is essentially becoming throughout the story. It's most evident in the mission leading up to Jason killing Voss, where they make it so obvious that honestly, I don't know if you can even call it subtext anymore. This is also where the whole insanity speech comes into play. So this idea that...
Did I ever tell you what the definition of insanity is? Insanity is doing the exact same thing over and over again, expecting shit to change.
is reflected in Voss. He has committed carnage and atrocities over and over again, and now has gone insane. If we look at this through the lens of video games, then the island can be seen as a representation of the game itself, a place whose sole purpose is to allow the player to commit as much carnage as they want, quite literally blocked off from the rest of the world. Jason is even told by the locals that he's destined to become a great warrior. So long as Jason stays on this island, his only purpose is to commit violence, which is where the game's meta commentary comes in. Far Cry 3 is essentially commenting on how us normal people can enter a game world, much like Jason entering this island, only to, within that world, become accustomed to inflicting violence. While we, in real life, are not sociopaths like Voss, what about our player character within the world? Sure, we're fine, but as far as Far Cry 3 is concerned, within the world of a video game, you are Voss. You're not Voss in real life, but you are in the game. This is why Voss is a reflection of Jason, and why Jason... So, the ending of the game makes sense considering the game's themes. Jason choosing to kill Voss is a representation of the player essentially choosing not to truly become this violent counterpart. The ending in which Jason leaves the island represents the player leaving behind the world of the game. Jason even comments on how he's leaving behind this life of violence.
I've killed so many people, I've lost count. I can't come back from this. I'm a monster. I can feel the anger inside me. But I am still somewhere inside me more than that. Better than that.
The ending in which Jason stays on the island only results in him dying, essentially punishing the player for leaving behind a normal life in favor of the carnage. Again, Far Cry 3 is not arguing that you, in real life, are a bad person, just your persona in the game. But this only makes the last third of Far Cry 3's narrative so underwhelming. For Far Cry 3's thematic point to land, the killing of Voss should have been one of the last missions of the game. It doesn't make sense for Jason to kill Voss, representing the player rejecting becoming this monstrous figure, only for several more hours of violent gameplay to follow. The last third of the game just completely abandons any of these meta themes that were built throughout the first two-thirds, making me wonder if these were even themes Far Cry 3 wanted to explore in the first place. The game makes enough deliberate narrative choices in the beginning that lead me to believe that they wanted to explore something, but I'm not sure how interested they were if the last third drops not only Voss, but also the meta commentary entirely. Far Cry is a franchise that's always felt like it wants to be about something, but never fully committing. After the unexpected success of Far Cry 3, the crazy villain has become a selling point of the franchise. Every game has to have some insane, memorable villain. And to be fair, the villains of the Far Cry franchise are fantastic, each with their own distinct personality and ideals, often far more memorable than most video game antagonists. And usually they're phenomenally voiced. Troy Baker, one of the best actors in gaming, play works as Pagan Min in Far Cry 4. And Breaking Bad fans may also recognize Giancarlo Esposito as being the only true exceptional part of Far Cry 6. But I can't say that Far Cry as a franchise has ever thematically been focused. Far Cry 6 wants to be a game about fascism, but since fascism is making a comeback, baby, the game doesn't actually critique fascism. The game doesn't really explore what exactly fascism ideologies are, how fascism rises, or why fascism doesn't work. Because doing so would mean actually explaining those fascist ideologies, which risks pissing off people who maybe don't realize that their political ideologies actually line up with fascism. So the game doesn't really appear to be saying anything more than fascism bad. Far Cry 5 seems to be a game that is more interested in exploring, let's just say, controversial themes. So aside from the crazy villain, another selling point of the Far Cry franchise has always been setting itself in exotic locations. Usually this means a tropical island, but it can also mean the Himalayas or the savannah. Far Cry 5 takes players to the exotic locale of Montana. The game follows the unnamed, unvoiced protagonists as they take on a cult of brainwashed Christians and... oh boy. So, I should reiterate before I continue that I do not believe Far Cry 5 is deliberately anti-Christian. The game is more interested in exploring religious fanaticism, or when people use religion as justification for horrific actions. While this isn't exclusive to Christianity, it's definitely a thing. That, and the emergence of far-right and alt-right political movements. The game is trying to show how these beliefs, taken to the utmost extreme, can cause an almost cult-like mentality. Another major theme of the game is the idea of manipulation. The cult's leader, Joseph Seed, is worshipped like a god within the cult. In fact, the first time we see Joseph, we don't even see Joseph himself, but instead an enormous statue erected by his cult. Joseph has essentially hijacked these people's faith, using it against them to bring himself to power, commenting on how certain political figures who shall not be named have done things that are similar. Members of the cult literally kill themselves in order to avoid their leader from being arrested, which sound familiar? But as much as Far Cry 5 wants to explore these themes, that seems to be where these themes begin and end. The game boasts having not one, but 4 villains. The game could have used this as an opportunity to explore different aspects of religious extremism, in particular how it relates to white nationalism within the United States. But it doesn't, instead paying lip service to moments that sound deep without actually saying anything at the risk of pissing off supporters of certain political figures who shall not be named. Far Cry 5 and 6 dress themselves with political commentary, but they are about as apolitical as it gets. And while the Far Cry games want to be about something deeper and more interesting, it often feels like a pale imitation of other, better games. As much as I admire Far Cry 3's attempt to deconstruct violence in video games, I feel that Spec Ops: The Line, released that same year, did a much better job at this kind of critique. And the thematic ideas of hijacking religion to elevate oneself to cult-like status, and the connection between religious extremism and white nationalism, I feel that BioShock Infinite explored better years earlier.
The Lord forgives everything, but I'm just a prophet, so I don't have to.
Far Cry stands out among Ubisoft titles as the one franchise that at least tries to be something more than just a video game, and for that I admire its ambition, but Far Cry at times seems to be somewhat unsure of itself in considering how far it wants to go with these themes. At times it appears to be doing something interesting only to not fully commit to its themes. Or it has the pretense of being profound and political, when in fact they're about as apolitical as most other video games. And as much as Far Cry has sold itself on its exotic locales, crazy villains, and political themes, it just as much sells itself on that destruction and carnage that third game wanted to thematically explore. And while playing through the later games, those moments of dumb violence and destruction are often the most fun parts of the game. I mentioned earlier that in communities that follow pieces of media, whether it be film, video games, or whatever else, there tends to be a split between the art house community and the entertainment community, both believing that the other to be everything wrong with modern critique and criticism. While I prefer the art house, I also recognize that entertainment has a place in art. Mad Max Fury Road has very little to offer in terms of art and themes. It's really just an action blockbuster. But it's also so incredibly well crafted that I have no problem in calling it one of the best movies of the 2010s. Sure, I'm not usually gonna rate entertainment art very high, but there's nothing wrong with enjoying a game just for the heck of it. And while Far Cry games aren't the best the industry has to offer, they're still undeniably fun to play. So as far as what kind of game I think Far Cry should be, I think MIA sums it up pretty well.
MIA, third world democracy. Yeah, I got more codes in the KGB. So, no funny business. Are you already off?